Before we get started, I want to make a couple announcements. First, I want to share one of our upcoming seminars. 2020 in Turmoil, a Jungian Astrological Perspective, with Boris Matthews, PhD, LCSW, NC-PSY-A, on Saturday, June 20th, from 1 to 4 p.m. online via Zoom. So if you're interested in that course, you'll have to adjust for your own time zone, of course. You can register for this course on our website, and we will send you a link to participate via Zoom the morning of the course. There are 3 CEs available. We're currently offering our courses online at 60% of our regular rate during this time of uncertainty. I also want to mention that the Salome Institute for Jungian Studies is having a couple of online salons with Kwame Scruggs, PhD, the title of the series being Life in the Shadow, Being Black in a Jungian World, and those are on June 27th and July 4th. And you can find more information about those courses at salomeinstitute.com, SALOME institute.com. Welcome to the Jungian Anthology Podcast, analytical psychology seminars from the archives of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. In the current context, it seems appropriate to share another full seminar, Racism and the Cultural Complex. Welcome to the United States of America, with Anita Mandley, LCPC, and Stephanie Fariss, JD, LCSW. From the seminar description, a recent article in the Huffington Post reads, "A white man guns down 9 black people in a church in South Carolina. The state's Confederate battle flag stays waving in the wind the next day. The white man is arrested. He is given a Kevlar jacket. Welcome to the United States of America in 2015. It is impossible to imagine how 350 years of slavery, segregation, and racism would not have monumental consequences for both white and black Americans. And yet, many want to believe that electing an African American president has changed all that. Events during the last year have turned that fantastical belief on its head, and now, more than ever, we must work to understand the insidious nature of racism. Depth psychology has an important role to play in this endeavor, especially as we begin to understand how shared historical and cultural trauma experiences lead to cultural complexes in groups and within the psyche of individuals. This course will explore the presence and power of historical and cultural traumas, how the legacy of these traumas impact the brains, bodies, and minds of individuals, and how the shared experience of trauma creates cultural complexes that structure emotional experience. More about the course, including learning objectives, recommended reading and viewing, and a link to the slides used in the talk are available in the show notes. Anita Mandley, MS LCPC, is a psychotherapist in Skokie at the Center for Contextual Change. The center is a group practice specializing in the treatment of trauma, violence, abuse, and neglect, working with both survivors and offenders. Ms. Mandley specializes in complex PTSD and dissociative disorders. Stephanie Fariss, JD, LCSW, is a psychoanalyst in Chicago and member of the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts. She has a private practice in the Chicago Loop, where she sees individuals and couples and runs psychotherapy groups. She has a special interest in the relevance of psychoanalytic thought to social issues such as addictions, race, organizational resilience, politics, and animal welfare.
One cool evening, a mother and a father took their 5-year-old son to the theater on the Upper West Side of New York City. The theater was crowded, and as the family rode the escalator down to the ground floor, the little boy got in the way of a white woman who pushed him aside and said, "Come on." The father's reaction was strong and immediate. He turned and spoke to this woman with words that were hot of the moment and of all of his history. She shrunk back, shocked, and a white man spoke up in her defense. The man was soon supported by other white people in the assembling crowd. The white man came closer, grew louder, and as the father pushed him away, the man said, "I could have you arrested." The father came home shaken, filled with a mixture of shame and rage. Another father might have left it at that, but this was Ta-Nehisi Coates. In the newly published Between the World and Me, Coates writes of this and many other revelations in an attempt to share with his now 15-year-old son his personal journey to discover what it means to be a black man in America. He goes on, "I have told that story many times, not out of bravado, but out of a need for absolution. I have never been a violent person. I've never felt the pride that is supposed to come with righteous self-defense and justified violence. But I had forgotten the rules. An error as dangerous on the Upper West Side of Manhattan as on the West Side of Baltimore. One must be without error here. Walk in a single file, work quietly, pack an extra number 2 pencil, make no mistakes. Had I informed this woman that when she pushed my son, she was acting according to a tradition that held black bodies as lesser, her response would likely have been, "And I'm not a racist." Or maybe not. But my experience in this world has been that the people who believe themselves to be white are obsessed with the politics of personal exoneration. And the word racist to them conjures, if not a tobacco-spitting oath, then something just as fantastic. There are no racists in America, or at least none that the people who need to be white know personally. In the era of mass lynching, it was so difficult to find who specifically served as the executioner that such deaths were often reported by the press as having happened, quote, "at the hands of persons unknown," end quote. And finally he says, "The mettle that it takes to look away from the horror of our prison system, from police forces transformed into armies, from the long war against the black body, is not forged overnight. This is the practiced habit of jabbing out one's eyes and forgetting the work of one's hands. To acknowledge these horrors means turning away from the brightly rendered version of our country as it has always declared itself, and turning toward something murkier and unknown. It is still too difficult for most Americans to do this, but that is your work. It must be, if only to preserve the sanctity of your mind." With this, Ta-Nehisi Coates invites his son and us to move beyond our tendency to live within a one-sided view of the world and confront what Jung called the shadow side of our personalities, the part of ourselves that we disavow, see as inferior, negative, worthless, primitive, and a part that can only be experienced through projection on another. Ta-Nehisi Coates' invitation reminds us that all is not lost, that there is much more to us than ego consciousness. But it means that we must move into those murkier, unknown places within. Today we'll explore how social forces and power relations in the psyche exist on multiple levels and can either limit us from becoming fully conscious or alternatively, allow us to develop greater consciousness. And so let us begin. We have a caveat here. We have a great deal of information to share with you today, and probably closer to 6 than 3 hours, but we're going to make adjustments as we go along so we can finish on time today. All right, so this is about racism and race. So what is race? What is racism? One of the most important takeaways from Ta-Nehisi's letter is how he redefines our notion of race. Citing history, he reminds us that race is a child of racism. It's not the other way around. He notes how white is as much a social construct as black, and that before white people were white, they had other identities that can refer to religion, culture, or country of origin. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of this in the early part of the 20th century. In his essays on being black, and again in The Souls of White Folk, he tells us the discovery of personal whiteness among the world's peoples is a very modern thing, a 19th and 20th century matter indeed. The ancient world would have laughed at such a distinction. The Middle Ages regarded skin color with mild curiosity. And even up into the 18th century, we ignored color, and race even more than birth. Today we have changed all that, and the world, in a sudden emotional conversion, has discovered that it is white, and by that token, wonderful. The term race was introduced into English in the 16th century and was defined as a small number of groups of human beings based on lineage and based partly on common descent. But it was used to mean a nation or a tribe or an ethnic group. Classical civilizations placed value on familial and tribal affiliations rather than physical characteristics when referring to a person's race. References to different physical characteristics were considered by classical thinkers like Hippocrates and Aristotle as being determined primarily by the climate and geography. So here I wanted to show you one drawing, a diagram that Jung had for the psyche. And what he shows here is, if you can see, these are like individual people, right? Okay, you have the one person. In the one, he lives in an isolated nation. Okay, we might say that H, central energy, is like the collective unconscious, and going on up through the various levels, we're talking about more archetypal energies. And then you move into E, which is an ethnic group. Again, people are connected in this situation together. But in D, the nation is separate. These two are connected in terms of nations, but this is separate. So in a way, and then he moves into tribe, and then family, and then the individual. And you might see this as various degrees of what the cultural unconscious might be composed of. So you have the individual family, which is more the personal unconscious. The tribe, nation, ethnic group, much more of the cultural unconscious. And then the primitive human ancestors down through the central energy, more of the collective unconscious. So back to race. The Enlightenment changed all these early notions of race when Europeans began to define race as a biological concept. Linnaeus, the modern concept of race was an invention originating in the 18th century with this man, Carl von Linnaeus. He created a taxonomic system to classify life, plants, animals, humans, including a system using color to classify races and assigning moral and intellectual capacities for each. So he described described Homo americanus as reddish, caloric, obstinate, contented. What happened there? I knew that was going to happen. There we go. And regulated by custom. Homo europaeus as white, fickle, sanguine, blue-eyed, gentle, and governed by laws. Guess what? Von Linnaeus was European. Homo asiaticus as sallow, grave, dignified, avaricious, and ruled by opinions. And Homo afer as black, phlegmatic, cunning, lazy, lustful, careless, and governed by caprice. Others in the 18th century built on this notion, concocted by Linnaeus, to prove the superiority of whites to blacks. Okay. Then came along someone named Johann Blumenbach, who classified 5 varieties of man: the Caucasian, which was the white race, the Mongolian, the yellow race, the Malayan, the brown race, the Ethiopian, the black race, and the American, the red race, probably because we're so angry. And then, do you know where the term Caucasian came from? Yes, the Caucasus Mountains. Blumenbach believed Caucasians to be the first race on Earth and took the name from Mount Caucasus, a mountain he believed cradled the most beautiful race, Georgia, at the Russian border. It's right down here. It is near the place where it was thought Noah's Ark rested after the flood. And in Greek mythology, it's where Zeus chained Prometheus to a rock. That is all. And now we have a white race and a black race. Scientists pursuing racial classifications in the 1800s relied on Blumenbach's classifications, cementing the term in anthropology as well as in cultural history. We know, of course, about efforts in the United States to prove white superiority to blacks. Listen to where this went at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The federal Constitution decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves when it views them in the mixed character of persons and property. This is, in fact, their true character. That was James Madison, who argued that slaves should be considered property for tax purposes and individuals for determining a state's population. The solution to this dilemma was the 3/5 compromise. 3/5 of a slave population was counted toward a state's total population, such that blacks then became 3/5 of a human being. I was sharing some of this with a friend this past week, and he reminded me about Othello. I was telling him that, race was a pretty modern invention. And he said, but Shakespeare wrote about the Black Moor. And I said, yes, but he wrote about the Black Moor. He didn't write about the black. And then I thought, I don't know enough about the Moors. I need to do some investigating. So I did a little research on the Moors, who were Muslim, since obviously I didn't remember or never thoroughly learned about them, and this is what I found. The African Moors' occupation of Spain began in 711 AD and lasted for 1,800 years through up till 1492, when actually they did accompany Spanish explorers who discovered America. They accompanied Columbus, but of course we didn't hear about them. In that time, they introduced advances in mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, physics, medicine, hydraulic engineering, geography, aviation, philosophy, art, agriculture, including intimate knowledge of irrigation. This is this guy who actually created an airplane. Why does this keep happening? He wasn't able to land it well, but he did get it up in the air. They brought universal education to Spain, while in Christian Europe, 99% of the population was illiterate, including many of the kings. Moorish Spain had 17 great universities, while Europe had 2, one in Paris and one in Oxford. It was the Moorish system of education that seeded the European Renaissance. Who knew? By the 10th and 11th century, Al-Andalus, which was Moorish Spain, had more than 70 public libraries when there were none in Europe. They introduced paper. This is one of the first pieces of paper. Arabic numerals. New crops such as citrus fruits, dates, ginger, sugarcane, cotton, silk, and rice. They advanced fashion and hygiene, inventing deodorant, toothpaste, shampoo, and starting a vogue by changing clothes according to the weather and the seasons. They introduced the use of crystal as a container for drinks and initiated the 3-course meal. Have any of you been to Cordoba? Any chance? It is if you ever go, please go see this mosque. It is unbelievable. The Moors brought the compass from China and other new knowledge from China, India, and Arabia to Europe. And long before there were castles in Europe, Moorish rulers lived in extravagant palaces and built other architectural wonders of the world, such as this one, the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Let's see this is the part of the inside. I don't know if you can see it. It's just, it's spectacular. Now this mosque is located in Cordoba, which was the capital of Al-Andalus. And Cordoba rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople as one of the most important cities in the world. It boasted a population of 500,000 in the 10th century, had street lighting, 50 hospitals with running water, 300 public baths, and 500 mosques. This is, should have moved that along. In Cordoba, the Moors, Jews, Muslims, and Christians live together in harmony. This is a part of that community that still exists. So why am I telling you this? Why is this important? The original Moors, like the original Egyptians, were black Africans. They had what was described as dark skin and woolly hair, and today would be deemed members of the black race. How many of you knew the story about the heritage of blacks in America?
You mean about the Moors?
Pardon me?
You mean about the Moors?
Well, as being a heritage of African Americans. How can it be that we don't know this? How many black Americans are unaware of their rich history? In a 1913 sociological text, the American Charles Elwood wrote, "The problem of the Negro and of the Indian, and of all uncivilized races, is essentially the same. The problem is how a large mass of people, inferior in culture and perhaps also inferior in nature, can be adjusted relatively to the civilization of a people much their superior in culture." So I'm arguing that by internalizing a culture and value system that promotes the superiority of one group over another, the people deemed inferior lose connection with their own value system and culture and begin to believe that all things associated with whiteness are superior and that all things associated with blackness are inferior. After centuries of slavery and decades of institutionalized oppression, Many blacks have adopted the culture and value system of white racist America. I liken this to soul murder. It's a term created in the 19th century as well by playwrights Henrik Ibsen and August Strindberg. It means, quote, the destruction of the love of life in another human being. In Leonard Shengold's Soul Murder Revisited, Thoughts About Therapy, Hate, Love, and Memory, he equates the destructive effects of child abuse with that of soul murder, and how through projective identification, the person who is abused frequently takes on the guilt of the crime, which the abuser may or may not have felt. I'm not saying African Americans are children who've been abused, but when somebody has undergone abuse or trauma that's so systemic, the result is the same. The guilt accompanied by a need for punishment leads to an identification with the aggressor and feeling, and sometimes acting on sadistic and vengeful impulses. The compulsion to repeat traumatic events results in passing down the abuse from one generation to the next. To summarize, the culture of the United States internalized the classification system of European theorists and continued the effort to prove whites were superior to blacks. Slavery supported a white ethnocentric model based on a belief in colorism, legally supporting that a person of color was a slave. Racism is not the same as prejudice. It is the belief that people differ along biological and genetic lines, and that one's group is superior to another. This belief is coupled with the power to negatively affect the lives of those deemed inferior. Racism, therefore, solidified in our cultural unconscious here in America a concept of race that denigrated Black Americans. So, you want to switch it up? She's doing it.
Can everybody feel their feet?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's check in. Excellent. Okay. All right, Eric. I know you got my back.
You're doing great.
Okay. Okay, so I do a fair amount of trainings on cultural and historical trauma. And I generally like to begin by explaining what it is, not because I think people don't know what it is, but just sort of to kind of have a common language or to understand the lens through which I see historical and cultural trauma. And I know we probably have a variety of ways people got to this training and perspectives they have on this kind of conversation. So maybe just coming to some kind of common place might be helpful. So just some basic assumptions about historical trauma. That it is, a mass trauma deliberately. It's interesting. And systematically inflicted upon a target group by a subjugating dominant group. That the trauma continues over an extended period of time. That people within that community have a universal experience of being traumatized and having experienced trauma. And that one of the major impacts, some of the major impact of this is that it derails the natural course and results in physical, psychological, social, and economic disparities across generations. And so how is historical trauma manifested? In this one, historical unresolved grief. And somebody earlier mentioned loss, right? This unresolved loss and grief, because there's actually rarely a context to, number one, even acknowledge that loss has happened, and two, a path for even discussing it or talking about that there actually has been loss, right? And so what have African Americans lost? What do you think? What do you think people have lost as a result of slavery? That's not talked about or resolved. What do you think? Any ideas? Okay, thanks, Stephanie. What do you think we've lost?
A loss of ambition.
Okay.
Personhood.
Oops. A loss of ambition?
Identity.
Huh?
Identity.
Could you say a little more about that?
Clear sense of self, of who they are.
Okay.
Where they came from as a family group, as a historical, you have the Genesis and you have so-and-so beget so-and-so and so-and-so, and you got the whole line of a community. So they might not have that.
Right.
Or loss of safety.
Loss of safety?
I would say loss of self-esteem, and I would go a little wider with the definition in terms of African American. I mean, somebody can walk into that without a history here. Come from Africa today, and it wouldn't take long to feel the cultural bias effects.
Anything else? Okay.
Equality?
I heard it, but I didn't.
That's from me.
Loss of
Equality.
equality. Loss of value. Dignity. Okay. Culture. Okay.
There's just the original loss of freedom. The original trauma of enslavement and the Middle Passage, of loss of just freedom, as well as home and everything. I mean, all that is lost when we leave a space, but added to that was that it was involuntary. It was violent. Something lost. There's so much that's lost in that.
I think it's a part of loss, but it's also a gain. The gain of shame and feelings like that. So it's from loss, but you get something.
Because actually shame is the secondary emotion of powerlessness. Right? We even see it with dogs. Right? When they come in contact with a dog that's more alpha or they perceive as dangerous, what do? They bend their head to a position of submission. That's the position of shame. Quite right. Yeah, somebody in the back.
I was hope. The loss of hope.
Loss of hope.
Loss of personhood.
Loss of personhood. Yeah, only 3/5. Yeah. Measure with a measuring cup. Yeah. Okay. And then disenfranchised grief. Any ideas what that means? What that's about? It's belonging. Yeah, ownership. Yeah, having some ownership and belonging. Yeah. Somebody else said you had your hand up.
I was going to say ownership, and even the ownership of the grief that you're experiencing.
Exactly. Yeah. Somehow there was, you have maybe rituals or ceremonies around death or whatever, but when you can't have a conversation or you're not allowed to acknowledge it, right? Because a part of what the narrative is almost like it didn't happen and it wasn't that bad.
Right.
And Black people ought to be glad, ought to appreciate that they were brought over here because now they have a better life. Yeah. Yes?
Which to me means that you can't even claim or touch what you feel. I mean, you must feel things at some level, but you can't afford to ground yourself in feeling.
That's why it has to be disenfranchised.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And then this internalized oppression, which is an interesting concept, kind of manifests in a variety of ways, even psychologically, in a psychological way, and in the narratives that we tell each other, that somehow, and this is an interesting thing that I've found across cultures, that somehow people of a darker hue have more value, right? Of a darker hue. Even within a brown race or a black race itself, still the lighter you are within that spectrum, the more value you have. So that's one way. But then also, it's an interesting kind of thing. When it comes to the internalized oppression, and you think about power, and how probably the thing that is hardest to tolerate and most traumatic is being powerless and immobilized, right? And so if there's no place to act out our natural aggressive tendencies, or not self-protective and aggressive impulses, that's what I meant, impulses, then at least we can do it to ourselves. And in some way, that gives us power, right? We don't have to wait for it to be done by somebody else. You can do it to yourself. So that's an interesting kind of way of looking at it. And then, a lot of times people will say, especially in work with children, underprivileged children or disenfranchised children, and they'll notice how strict and stern the mothers are, right? And so why was that? So we can think about how that probably came about. Probably came about from slavery, because if the children misbehaved, what was going to happen? They might get sold. They might be beaten with whips. They might be killed, right? So how would a mother protect a child? Punish them first, and punish them strongly enough so that the master and the overseer could see that it was taken care of, and then they wouldn't do it. Right? So it's sort of a tradition of, how do we have power, but yet it's really sort of this internalized oppression. Am I making sense? Is this? Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So you think about, in Africa, a lot of times people will say, well, Africans had slaves. And they did. I have a first-person account of a slave written, and was born in 1795. And he was captured from eastern Nigeria when he was about between 10 and 12, from what I can tell. And this is how he describes his experience with slavery in Africa. He says, how different was their condition from that of the slaves in the West Indies. With us, they do no more work than other members of the community, than even their master. Their food, clothing, and lodging were nearly the same as theirs, except that they were not permitted to eat with those who were freeborn. And there was scarcely any other difference between them than a superior degree of importance which the head of a family possesses in our state. So there's probably a lot of difference between this experience of slavery and the experience of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, or maybe even in Europe, right? The children played together. Everybody shared a common language. There was a common religion. Often the slavery came to an end after a certain period of time. They were respected as people. They were allowed to marry. They were allowed to participate in dance and music and culture. Right? It's a very different experience. And so this concept of post-traumatic slave syndrome, is it warm in here? It's okay, because sometimes I have my own private summer, so I just have to check what's going on in here. Yeah. So post-traumatic slave syndrome is a concept pretty analogous to post-traumatic stress disorders, but describes specifically the impact of slavery and its manifestations in present day. And it's African Americans sustain psychological and emotional injury as a direct result of slavery and continue to be injured by traumas caused by the larger society's policies of inequality, racism, and oppression. A less severe form of violence and abuse continued after slavery, officially ending with peonage, black codes, convict leasing, lynchings, beatings, threats of life and property, the rise of the Klan, Jim Crow segregation, the death of Emmett Till, the race riots of the 1960s, the 1989 beating death of Mulugeta Sarah, an Ethiopian American, by white supremacist groups, the near election of an ex-Klansman to governor of the state of Louisiana, the 1992 beating of Rodney King, the 1999 dragging death of James Byrd in Jasper, Texas, by 4 white youth, the police shooting death of Amadou Diallo in 1999, the 2002 police beating of 16-year-old Donovan Jackson Chavis, a special education hearing impaired youth. All of these events and more remind African Americans every day that the trauma has never really ceased and that it is likely to continue if there is no intervention. And I think this is kind of the recent experience of African Americans with this police shooting situation and shooting of young black males and females, actually. And so this is from another slave narrative, Ida Hutchinson, born 1865. They say Negroes won't commit suicide, but Esom told us of a girl that committed suicide. There was a girl named Lou who used to run off and go to the dances. The patrollers would try to catch her, but they couldn't because she was too fast on her feet. One day they got after her in the daytime. She ran to the cabin and got her quarter, which she had hid. She put the quarter in her mouth. The white folks didn't allow the slaves to handle no money. The quarter got stuck in her throat and she went all down to the slough and drowned herself rather than let them beat her and mark her up. They intended to make an example to the rest of the slaves, but they didn't get Lucy. So it's an interesting kind of thing because that's sort of a narrative of survivor and power and value. Suicide. So you think about how suicide happens in 2015. Does it happen in gang wars? Does it happen through police side, I guess is the term they use, doing something that will guarantee that you do get shot? Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting construct to think of suicide as power, suicide as value, taking your power back. And I was talking to Stephanie and I was telling her, spoken, especially in the 60s, used to have a fair amount of contact with, had several African professors in college in late 60s, early 70s. And they would eventually bring up the fact that the African Americans were the ones who didn't have enough courage to kill themselves, to jump off the ships. So they sort of kind of looked a little down on African Americans, the Africans, because we're the descendants of slaves that didn't have enough courage to kill themselves. And something to ponder.
There's, I think though, within that last quote, there may be not only blackness, but gender as well, because women also, sometimes the only power they may have, and I only know this from my research I did with the law refugees, a woman committed suicide as her way of having power over the family.
Mm-hmm.
So,
it's a good point.
It's a gender issue.
It could also be gender issue. Great point. So, speaking even on a neurobiological level, when people experience trauma and abuse, they have changes in the way the brain works that's going to determine how they deal with stress. And this could be one way where people who have been abused are at more risk of suicide. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Is there something I can do so that it doesn't do that?
We'll look at it during the break.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Okay. All right.
Could you go back just so I could get the source of that? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And then also what science is telling us now is that there's a new biological model of PTSD and therefore PTSS, post-traumatic slavery syndrome, in which there's an actual alteration of genes, and that it changes a person's stress response and leads to the disorder of PTSD, PTSS. So there's a genetic thing that also is happening. African Americans have a long multi-generational history of nutritional deprivation, excessive workloads, and poor health due to years of slavery and the post-slavery period of economic hardship. The intrauterine environment experienced by one generation can influence the intrauterine environment that she creates for her offspring, in theory helping perpetuate certain biological and metabolic states, albeit in a fading fashion across multiple matrilineal generations. So if you think about how traumatic stress impacts the immune system, impacts the development of the brain, while the limbic system is overdeveloped and the cortical structures are underdeveloped, when you think about what it does to metabolism, when you think about the fact that the slaves who survived the Middle Passage were the ones that retained sodium and salt and didn't need as much water, right? And then you think about prevalence of high blood pressure in African Americans. They were the ones who had slow metabolisms, right? So that they didn't have to be fed much and could still survive. So you think about, prevalence of obesity in African American community. What started out as strengths and resources and resiliencies, in this context now, vulnerabilities. Not only vulnerabilities, but vulnerability in terms of how people are viewed, right? So you see somebody, I don't know if anybody saw the movie Precious. You see an African American female about the size of Precious. Do you think, wonder why she's not handling that weight? Or do you think, post-traumatic slavery syndrome? Because it has a difference, too, in the way we assign responsibility and perhaps even blame. Where does it lie? What's the shame? Right. And then this, again, concept of internalized oppression is when a member of an oppressed group believes and acts out the stereotypes created about their group. Any idea why that could happen? Why would someone act out the stereotypes that have been created? Any thoughts about that? Well, one thing is it assures them of a spot, right? Someone mentioned belonging earlier, right? It's probably a way to belong is be who people say you are, right? If you're not who people say you are, you're going to be in danger. You're going to be in trouble. Yes?
It's their survival. You have to adapt to the group for your own survival.
Right.
Could there be also, though, playing with that, knowing, I mean, usually a minority group knows more about the majority group than versus vice versa, so there may be bicultural issues involved here.
Yeah,
They can play on the system, but with their own group, they can be who they want to be.
So it's an interesting thing you mention it, because when I do this training, sometimes I have people do an experiment with this model developed by Pamela Hayes. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. It's called the addressing model, and it's a way of assessing for culture. And so a couple of things are really interesting, but when people identify ethnicity or culture, right, they usually say, oh, German Irish, or one or two things or whatever. So at the end, I do my own for the participants, and I said, I live in 3 worlds. So I live in a greater American world, culture, that's my culture. I live within an African American culture. And then within an African American culture, my family is originally from New Orleans, so I live within a New Orleanian culture, which is even different than the larger African American culture. We talk differently. When I was little, people spoke Creole, right? And that was like a long time ago. But so it was a different language. We ate different foods. We had different rituals, things like that. So the thing about being multicultural is actually true. And I'm guessing people in the larger American culture, and maybe even with being a New Orleanian, there's a larger New Orleanian culture, right? And then a African American New Orleanian culture. Then within the African American New Orleanian culture, there's a Black culture and a Creole culture. So all these layers, right, exist. And you're right, I'm guessing that people in the larger American culture don't know that much about a Creole New Orleanian culture or Black New Orleanian culture. So, yeah, great point. I keep thinking you're raising your hand.
Well, I was. But
Oh.
I was thinking that too, and talking about, a way to belong and survival, but also thinking about the effects of having your identity and yourself erased and the void that leaves for something powerful, a majority culture or the value system, to take its place in around the unconscious.
Great point. Oh, that's mine for right now.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's mine for right now. I'll pick up later.
Anita and Stephanie, would this be a good time for a break? Because we're about to.
Sure, we can do it now.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to talk. We're running out of time, so I'm going to maybe skip through a few parts of this. But how many of you are familiar with Jung and Jung's structure of the psyche? Not too many. Okay. All right. Well, I will go over this then. Is this 17? Yes. Okay. Jung was very, very interested in the collective. I mean, that's his main idea, and also extremely into studying the differences and similarities between groups of people and their cultures. He explored sacred traditions and symbols of other peoples throughout the world, and as well as national personality characteristics. In many ways, he was attuned to the cultural unconscious, but he never named it. this was left to a Jungian analyst to flesh out the role that culture plays in our psychic makeup. So somewhere between the personal unconscious that originated with Freud and the collective unconscious that is associated with Jung is what Jungian analyst Joseph Henderson postulated as the cultural unconscious. And I talked to you about that just at the beginning with the wavy lines and all the different layers. So you can see that the bottom sort of layer at the bottom into the depths of everything is what Jung considered the collective unconscious. But how those archetypal images are often experienced in the world are colored and fleshed out and clothed in cultural imagery. Okay. So the cultural unconscious is the layer of the unconscious that's structured by large cultural patterns and attitudes that exist in groups. Jung believed in the reality of the psyche, meaning that elements in the personal, cultural, and collective unconscious are just as real as ego consciousness, what we normally consider to be reality, even though they're experienced initially as shadow. Okay, before I say very much more about shadow projections, I thought I would just make sure everybody understands what projections are in general. The idea is that we are so sure that somebody else is acting or behaving a certain way that resonates with something historically that's happened in our lives. And we're just so sure that's the case. And here Dr. Froelich is suggesting that the anxiety is and all the projections aren't real and just they're real, but they're something to be evaluated. They're shadow projections. And I want to say, just acknowledge that Harry Wilmer, who was my original Jungian analyst, drew this and many more images to try to convey various concepts in analytical psychology that are sometimes difficult to understand. He doesn't have the cultural unconscious listed here, but you get the idea that there's the ego has a perception, the personal unconscious and the cultural unconscious project something on that person that's hated, and that at the core of that is an archetypal shadow, which makes it much more painful and difficult for us to manage the feelings that come up when it's connected at such a deep level of our psyche. So in Jungian parlance, what we experience as shadow are intense, irrational projections of unconscious and undeveloped parts of ourselves that we tend to project onto other individuals and groups. He defines the shadow as the unknown side of the personality, its inferior, less developed qualities. And so the work of analysis, or any time we're moving into the murkier parts and the unknown parts of our psyche, involves a confrontation with one's own shadow. In Flannery O'Connor's brilliant short story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, a recent college graduate named Julian escorts his mother to her weekly class at the YMCA via the city bus. Julian views himself as intellectually superior and enlightened about race and social equality, and continually attempts to distinguish himself from his mother, who he sees as backward and bigoted. Throughout the story, it becomes increasingly clear that while Julian is irritated with his mother's racist attitudes, he lacks the ability to relate or connect to African Americans and has no more understanding of them than his bigoted mother. Moreover, his attempt to connect with them is made primarily to make a point to his mother, rather than to have any compassion for them as a people. We would say that Julian's mother is a shadow figure, and that both he and his mother share a cultural unconscious. His attempt to embrace a new social order through rebellion against his mother's antiquated views keeps him safely in the bosom of a cultural unconscious that keeps African Americans separate and apart, alien to their experience. Other Jungian analysts have expanded the concept of the cultural unconscious and applied Jung's concept of complex theory to the cultural level of the psyche, introducing the concept of the cultural complex. The cultural complex functions like a personal complex, meaning it leads to unconscious, feeling-tone trains of thought that tend to possess and stand in for the ego, blocking its ability to reflect on different ways of thinking or feeling. Cultural complexes often originate with a traumatic experience that's shared by an entire cultural group. So today we're talking about slavery and systemic and institutionalized racism. These shared trauma experiences lead to shared cultural complexes of the group as a whole, as well as within the psyches of individual group members. Unbeknownst to us, cultural complexes structure our emotional experience and can distort our reality, coloring it to fit an earlier experience or trauma. So that when a complex is constellated, a person may feel possessed by a strong force that cannot be willed away. A cultural complex collects experience that confirms a group's historical point of view and provides a simplistic certainty about the group's place in the world, in the face of otherwise conflicting evidence. So I was reflecting on the history of white Americans who immigrated to this continent. We kind of started off with our discussion about them. Many were escaping religious persecution. And as many of you know, the earliest groups of people to arrive on this continent or primarily were Puritans and a group called the Levelers. They struggled against a fear of the primitive, namely the American Indians as they saw them, and engaged in witchcraft trials to protect them from the unknown. They were terrified of the unconscious. The foundation of the Puritans' belief that the world was a corrupt place, but one that could be transformed through hard work, eventually became the cornerstone of the American dream, one of mastering one's own destiny. Like Julian, who saw himself as beyond the traumas and small-mindedness of his antiquated mother, European immigrants who landed at Ellis Island were eager to leave behind their pasts, their painful pasts, and discover a piece of the American dream. Having experienced their own historical collective trauma in their home country and fearing the unknown, they functioned out of a cultural complex, one that promoted a binary worldview, conscious versus unconscious, outside versus inside, us against them, superior versus inferior. Now, I'm telling you all this because very often we're all, I'm preaching to the choir about racism, right? We all are here for a reason because we want to understand it. But often what we're talking about has to do with what's wrong, what's systemically wrong, and how we can help African Americans, right? What we can do. But we're not working on ourselves, which is really what the cultural complex is all about. What is our history? What are our traumas? What is it that leads us to be caught in a cultural complex so that we project things on either other white people, black people, whoever, who seem different, right? And we then lack an ability to stay focused, centered, and reflect on what we're projecting. Analytical psychology invites us to value experiences that stem from a world field other than that of the conscious mind. We're encouraged to be open and curious, willing to suffer impingements, and face the fear that comes when facing what is when one is facing what is murky and unfamiliar. Within the United States, whites have historically considered themselves to be regular and in alignment with dominant social norms, certainly not ethnic. This white system, based on patriarchal European ideas, and somebody brought up gender, we live in a patriarchy, holds the development of individual autonomy in high regard, whereas in most cultures, a person is defined as a social being, and developing a capacity for empathy and connection with others is the developmental ideal. Now, this goes against even the cultural unconscious of Jungians, right? Jungian analysts, which is all about individuation, separating yourself from the collective, finding your own individual path. But we also need to look at what that leaves out and what that cultural complex is and what we need to do possibly to look at other cultures, what they have to offer us that we are not responding to or integrating within ourselves. I'm going to stop here just because we're running out of time, and why don't you pick up from here?
So, now this is a slides I didn't change the wording too much because it's actually a quote. So I know Stephanie told me not everybody in here is going to be a therapist, but still, I think probably all of us are people of goodwill. If you're not a person of goodwill, raise your hand. So, Stephanie was just talking about sort of like concepts of our own cultural complex and our own shadow parts or whatever. And as people of goodwill, psychotherapists or people tend to see themselves as non-judgmental and lacking in malignant bias. They are in many instances trained to become aware of their judgments and to let them go, and cautioned to maintain neutral, objective stances in relationship to others, clients. This narrative of the unbiased, non-judgmental is deadly to the development of kind of cultural confidence, because it presumes a way of being that is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. So Stephanie would say, it is difficult, if not impossible, not to be impacted by our own cultural complexes. Is that right, Stephanie?
That's exactly right.
All right, I'm getting it little bit by little bit. Yeah. So I can tell you like a couple of examples. First of all, just to say how I even got interested in this topic, and I told the story to Stephanie. I was working with a Jewish woman who had some trauma in her history, and she is probably in her early 30s, and she is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And she was leaving my office. She said, it's so nice to sit with a therapist who's a survivor. I was like shocked, right? And I was like, I started to dispute it. And then I said, I just, like all these shadows started coming to my consciousness until I actually had to acknowledge that I was a survivor. That was really hard for me to acknowledge that. And then I began to see the power of it in my life. And I remember when Barack Obama was elected in the first time, and there's the Grant Park thing, and I took my daughter out of school, she's 7th, 8th grade or whatever, and I'm like, I want her to be able to tell her grandchildren that she saw, the first black president, right? So we go down there, we're chilling, everybody's having a good time, so to speak. And then he and his family came on stage. And it was only at that moment that I realized the real reason I was there, which was I wanted to make sure he was still alive. Mm-hmm. And the first thought that came in my head when they walked on the stage was, they didn't kill him. Right? Because my shadow part says, once you go beyond a certain place, if you get out of your spot, if you get off your spot, they're going to have to kill you. And so I was sure that he was not going to come out, right? But I didn't know that was why I was there, right? And then it's so interesting because I think there has been sort of a lot of what Stephanie refers to as attempts at the soul murder since he's been elected, right? But that's another topic for another day. But so just after my client told me that, these just little waves of experiences came into my consciousness, right? All these kind of what I would call dissociated pieces and constructs, things that I really didn't think about or weren't even in my awareness, just began to come online. You know, it was mentioned that I've been studying somatic experiencing, Peter Levine's somatic treatment for trauma. And we worked on this prenatal perinatal thing. There's this technique about this. And my thing I worked on was being able to emerge, right? And I initially thought it was about sort of my own birth story, which was that my mother was watching the World Series with Jackie Robinson and she wouldn't go to the hospital. And so I couldn't come out until after the game was over. So I thought that was the emerge story. But since I've worked on it, I'm like so aware of all the places where I think I am not allowed to emerge. You know, so even doing this at the CG Young Institute is actually for me emerging. You know, kind of getting off my spot. I know it might sound weird, Steve, but it's actually an exercise in emerging to me. So it's an interesting kind of thing. One of the reasons I really love my practice, the owner of my practice, I was so institutionalized, and I said, I don't know how much I should charge for my fee. How much should I charge? And she looked at me, she was a Jewish woman, Mary Jo Bear. She goes, what's it like to ask a white woman how much you're worth? And no one had ever said anything like that to me before. It was just curious. She was just like, but I thought, at least she thought of it and she asked it, and there's not that many places where that's going to happen. And I took it for granted that she was going to tell me how much my time was worth. Yeah. So that's, I think, getting at sort of the shadow pieces that are sort of have been outside of my awareness, that since that woman said that about me being a survivor, has begun to come back online. Is that making sense? And so, you know, another thing, just in terms of shadow pieces. So in August of 2011, I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. I'm cancer-free now, but thank you very much. But ever since after the chemo and stuff, my hair is not normal. So it's a very weird thing. And I'll tell you kind of, Stephanie's looking at me. One, it no longer gets nappy. Now, most people would think, oh, what's the big deal? But my nappy hair was part of my identity, and I didn't quite know who I was without it. My hair is straight now. Not only that, it's thin, right? It hasn't grown all the way back in. And I remember, and I was I'm still am a little traumatized, and you would think, Anita, you're cancer-free. They tell you there's less than a 5% chance that it'll come back. You should be really appreciative. Why are you traumatized about something as minor as hair? But can you guess why, as an African American woman would get traumatized around hair? Yeah. And what came online is this memory. I must have been 5 years old, and I used to have like very long, very thick hair when I was younger. And my Aunt Mildred said, you better not ever cut your hair because that's the only thing you have going for you because you're so dark. She's Creole. She's from New Orleans. That's her culture. That's my culture, right? So the fact that my hair doesn't really grow too much anymore, that it's very, very thin, means I don't have the same value, right? I think that's a cultural complex, right, Stephanie? Yeah. So I was just going to talk a little bit about this. I was telling Stephanie about this, and she thought she was very curious about it. My grandmother had a cousin named Verna, and her cousin passed for white. And she married a fairly wealthy white man, right? And my grandmother went to work for her as the maid, which might sound weird, right? But that meant she had access to privilege, my grandmother. So her cousin, at a time like in the 40s, was able to help my grandmother put her children through college, which was sort of a lot of power. She gave her the extra crystal and all this fancy stuff that she didn't want. She gave them all clothes, all these. So my grandmother appreciated her so much, she named my mother after her, actually. They were so close, right? But just this concept that, in those layers of culture that I exist within, probably in the greater American culture, maybe in the greater African American culture, maybe in the New Orleanian African American culture, passing is like, how dare you, deny who you are, whatever. But in the Creole, New Orleanian culture, it means it's a way of having power, value, and connection and control over your life, which is sort of the antidote to the trauma, the counterweight to the trauma. So I just wanted to touch on that just a little bit. Okay, thank you.
All right, now we're going to blow you away, unfortunately, in a not fun way. Let's see, I'm going to exit that show. There we go.
Barren, strange fruit, blood on the leaves, and blood at the roots. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South. Them big bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. Scent of magnolia, green and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit. The crows black. The rain together for the wind. to suck all the sound to rot all the leaves to drop.
We're talking about racism post-slavery with that film. And we talk about slaves, and when we talk about what's happened to African Americans, we really focus on that. But we don't focus on what happened after that, and Anita said some things about it. The Jim Crow laws, the separate but equal way of operating, the lynchings that occurred whenever African Americans were able to be successful in developing communities. That was such an assault to white consciousness that had to be destroyed in some way. So I guess as part of this, and I think Anita's going to talk some more about microaggressions and things like that, but think about ways in which we operate unconsciously, carrying some of this in our cultural heritage, because it's in all of us, right? I see these pictures and I see the children there, and am horrified. And we talk about ISIS and what ISIS has done and how brutal. But this was just, this was within the last 100 years or so that many of these things happened. The episode in Jasper was 1999. So all within our lifetimes. So, do we need to process? You want to talk about this some? Because it's pretty heart-wrenching, and as Anita reminds me, what's the word you use? Activating.
I was surprised to see women in the Ku Klux Klan. Somehow I didn't realize that there were women.
Yeah, like we were somehow.
Women should know
Yeah, we were more virginal.
Right.
There was one thing that just a quick fleeting thought went through with a couple of those scenes there, where the people have their back against the hanged man. As it just reminded me how sometimes hunters will string up a deer and then take a photo of the catch. It's trophy kind of.
Why don't you stand up here and join me? Yeah.
It was, sad to see it that way. That it's just another animal, or and of course, animals have sensitivity too. So.
But what do you think about the fear that someone would have, or what's going on with them that they would be so threatened by an African American person? I mean, it really points to how terrified many people in our culture are, in the white culture, of the unconscious, and what it holds. Yeah.
I was aware as I was watching that how often when I've been shown images of the KKK or white supremacist groups, or even the proliferation of movies about Nazis and seems to just keep coming and coming, that it's often a way for me to set myself apart and say, those are evil people who do evil things, and I feel so different from that. And I think a lot of white people in our country have that. And you guys alluded to this earlier, that we really like to position ourselves as different from those bad people. And what came up for me is wondering what on earth is going on unconsciously for, within me and people I know that are vestiges of this kind of hate and this kind of racism, and something less alienating than the images of the KKK.
Well, I mean, I can give you an example. My Pilates instructor is an African-American woman. She's a little older than me, and I adore her. I probably wouldn't be standing here. I'd be crippled if it wasn't for her. She's just very gifted. And I was telling her about this workshop, and she just came back from Charleston. She and her husband both, he is one of the founders of Muntu Dance Company. I don't know if you're all familiar with that. It's an African-American dance company. And she does body work, and they went to Charleston to work with some of the congregational members that were a member of the church where people were killed. And she was talking about their faith, and I could say more about that, but the point I wanted to, in response to your comment, one thing I wanted to say is I was talking about this, I was talking about the shadow, and I was talking about the dark parts of oneself, and then I realized what I've said in terms of dark and what that meant. And I said, you know what, that right there that feels like a microaggression. I wasn't even conscious of my language and how that might come across or what that might feel like to someone who is identified as being dark, right? Anyway, she came back and was talking about she was talking to some of the women who are like in their 80s or 90s and the power of their faith. It really wasn't, I don't know how many of you saw the women forgiving the white boy that whatever
Dylan Storm.
Pardon me?
Dylan Storm.
Yeah. Forgiving him. And we could have shown that too. It's extremely powerful to watch and imagine that people have the strength to do something like that. And of course my friend Judith Cooper told me about a New Yorker article that she sent me about how that in itself is controversial among the African American community because they're forgiving, but where's the fight? Where is the African American standing up for oneself and saying this isn't okay? So even within the African American community, that's a tension. But for us to really see how in subtle ways we're carrying this legacy in terms of our cultural unconscious, it's really important.
Yeah. I think it also mentioned, Stephanie, that in the context of what was mentioned earlier, the American dream.
Yes.
That when you look at that video and then you consider, land of opportunity, home of the free, land of the,
yeah.
Home of the brave.
Home of the brave, land of the free.
Land of the free.
There you go.
Yeah.
It loses its meaning.
Yeah. Well, the sense that there's winners and losers. That in order for some people to feel like it's the land of the free and the home of the brave, like it felt like those people standing there were proudly like, oh yeah, land of the free, home of the brave, thanks to us keeping it safe or whatever their way of understanding it was. Of that, in order for us to have what we need to destroy the other.
Eric?
I hope I'm not wrong with this, but I think the song Strange Fruit was written by the son of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. And his parents, in his view, were lynched because of being other. And so, very empathetic song. I could be wrong, but I think it was.
In 1976, and I remember it distinctly because I was pregnant, I was driving down to the Smokies and passed in Knoxville, Tennessee, a Baptist church that had a marquee outside of it. And the marquee read, God created the races different. White, holy, Jew devil, black beast. And I thought and thought how it would be to have that as a part of your daily life, to drive by that declaration. And I think so much of what we're talking about has to do with control, with maintaining power. And that's the institutional part of all of this. And it's really important to acknowledge it, that the Second Amendment only says that state militias are, an important part of things, because the state militias were organized to enforce slavery. And they were organized groups of white gun owners who would make sure that slaves didn't escape. And then you get the whole thing, which I'm sure you all read about, in the housing policy, federal housing policy after World War II, where the Democrats, they wanted to have a housing program, housing subsidies, but to get the law passed, the Democrats had to let the Southern Republicans or whoever it was dictate that would be segregated housing. And so for a generation, the federal government only subsidized segregated housing, which let white working class people develop some equity and black people not have any equity. And that is all institutional, and it's all about control. And psychologically, but out there socially as well.
Thanks, Renda. Did you want to take it from here?
So I just had another little shadow come on board. So I have to tell you the truth. This is my acknowledgement, and I usually don't make acknowledgements after noon. I'm going to make an exception because I really like you guys. When Stephanie first showed this video, I said, Stephanie, you can't show all of that. They're going to be traumatized. And Stephanie, nope, it's okay. They can be activated. And so whatever. So when I was sitting there and I realized it was because of how activated I get. Because when I watch it, it's not about other people. It's really about me. And that could be me. And it does a whole different thing to my nervous system and to my brain or whatever, I think, because I identify so much with the prey, so to speak. So is that a cultural complex, Stephanie? She's teaching me about this whole cultural thing. Yeah.
And you know what happens to
Barbara?
me? Yes.
Uh-huh.
What happens to me is I can make it all of the white people are other and the black people are other. That's not me. And as I watched it, that's what I was so aware of. Is, because you sort of brought to the core, we're also there. But it's just too hard for me to acknowledge any of that icky as part of me.
Yes.
As a person of color, it's definitely activating a lot. It's very, very intense. I wondered about other groups at the time and what their response was to see what was being done to African Americans.
Can you give an example, like what it did to?
Like the feeling of, okay, these people are being persecuted. Am I next? As a person of color. Because, during segregation, of course, there were other groups like Hispanics living also watching what was happening.
Or Asian, Chinese Americans, or Japanese.
Right. So
Native
that's
Americans.
Something that I was starting to kind of, and I don't know, I'm thinking now about a lot of stuff is coming up with Donald Trump. I'm thinking this moment feels like stuff is coming up in regards to his comments about the wall.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of.
It feels the same to you. Ron?
I'm just wondering about acknowledging being activated. I am activated, and I can't believe I'm the only person here that isn't activated. That's what I find kind of
Like we've got a lot of intellectual takes on this. I mean, I was left with, this is like the Auschwitz of America. I was left with extreme, for me, sadness. And almost like, not put into words even that. And so, I mean, I just find it interesting that the same is going on, I think, here a little.
Oh, definitely. I think many people are very sad.
That's why I want to make it all of them. Not me, because
that's a defensive.
You don't want to be.
So we can move into intellect, we can move
Right.
into a variety of defenses, so we don't have to feel
Right.
that intense sadness that you're talking about.
Because I think we're reactive even if we don't look reactive.
Yes.
I think beyond, in addition to sadness, one of the harder things as a white woman having privilege is the shame.
Yeah.
Because I was like, those weren't literally my ancestors. My grandparents were in Romania. That was not me. The truth is, I carry the privilege of being a white person to those people. So culturally, those are my ancestors. That child, that mother, that man are those people. And I think that's the work that we have to do. And it was so powerful when you talk about the layers of post-slavery syndrome. I think there's also the impact of being white in our culture, the pathology of whiteness, of ignoring these, like going on and having a picnic after something horrible like that. That's a pathology that I think culturally we all carry as white people that we have to begin to look at in order to heal, not even our culture, but ourselves. And I just think, I don't know, I think it's so powerful to look at the intergenerational impact for people of color, but I think also we as privileged people have to do that harder work and sit with the shame, not the sadness, because the sadness can move into, that was so sad, that it's, pity or something. The truth is, it's all of us. That's a very
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because shame actually was my primary emotion. It's kind of an interesting thing. And the shame is there's somewhere that if it were a cognition or verbalization, and I even struggle to say it, is like, how do we let those people do that to us? It's almost like, why didn't we jump off the slave ship? Do you know what I mean? The shame is in the powerlessness. And almost like, I work a lot with trauma survivors, abuse survivors, or whatever, and they always almost always carry this piece up. It was my fault because I didn't stop it, or I didn't fight, or I didn't do this, so I didn't do that. And so the shame, it's interesting you mentioned, that's the primary emotion for me, even stronger than sadness, is like this, I can't believe, do you know what I mean? Yeah. Somebody else had their hand up. Yes.
I had heard that song for a long time, and I had no idea what it was about.
Oh, Strange Fruit.
Until very recently, we were listening to a radio show, and the song was played, and a comment was made, and it blew my mind. That's how I dissociated I think we can be in the culture, that we don't even know what the content is. I didn't, and I had heard that song before. It just blew my mind that was what it was about. It was like some world opened, a window opened up that I had no idea that that's what the song was about. And listening to it now, it's like, how could I have not known? Especially with Nina Simone singing it, but
anybody else need to use the words?
I just wanted to say, this is, it might seem like it was provocative to show, but I think what Judith is saying about the music, the song, I think we live with this all the time, but it's way back there. It's not front and center, but it's front and center for African Americans all the time. And that's what we need to be much more aware of, is putting this out there for us to look at and face it and reflect on it and think about it, and have us understand how this operates in us. Very important.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I'm trying to understand how this operates in myself, and I'm wondering if the flip side of shame is rage. That is, if you say shame is in the powerlessness, then it strikes me that rage or anger is a way of constructing an identity.
And having some power.
And having some power.
Exactly
but
right.
Would you then say that the people who are in the pictures that you just showed us are acting out their own shame?
That could actually be like the projection of sort of like their own guilt and shame and culpability and need to make others lesser. Yeah. But not consciously. I don't think it.
No, obviously not consciously, but I'm hearing some no's around here, and I'm wondering, why are you saying no? I'm just interested. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I just wonder why would people? What's wrong with that idea? I need to know that.
I think shame, rage, a person's own inferiority, it could be so many things that is part of shadow.
Right.
That we don't want to see in ourselves, they didn't want to see in themselves, so they acted it out. And by projecting it on people that they thought were lesser than them.
And would you say that shame is inherited? That is, if trauma can be inherited, would you say that the dimension of trauma that is shame is also inherited?
On many levels. So it can be part of the personal unconscious, it can be part of the cultural, and definitely it's part of our archetypal realm. It exists. Yes.
Great points. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the biology, neurobiology, and the evolutionary kind of way of bias. An evolutionary bias in psychology indicate that humans are coded to notice difference. Now, I know a lot of us with this relatively recent emphasis on neurobiology and the limbic system and the amygdala and all that, right? Especially within trauma. I think a lot of times we think the amygdala is registering threat. But how does it decide what's a threat? It notices, what it's actually noticing is difference, right? It's coded to notice difference, right? Because difference is really, since our primitive ancestors, is what was interpreted as threat. Sameness, or someone belonging to our tribe, more or less, so to speak, our species, our tribe, looks like us, was considered safe, right? And the social engagement piece comes on and all that. But then the amygdala registers threat, but it picks up difference in order to register threat. So it says, limbic systems, also implicated in the trauma response, light up and become active when data become available that another human differs in some way. Their limbic systems are the components of human brains that run in parallel, so side by side, they're not intersecting, with the cognitions of the prefrontal cortex, and that, as any trauma therapist knows only too well, can overpower the thinking brain, firing more quickly and with more impact. The notion that a therapist, or anyone I might add, can be unbiased presumes the absence of limbic system input, as well as of any personal life history that has ascribed meaning to difference, either positive or otherwise. No psychotherapist matches these criteria. So in other words, our limbic systems are always noting difference, and almost always, or often, difference is interpreted as threat or responded to as threat. So even when you think about these police shootings, say, just to kind of put it within a context, right? Why do black men run when they see a police officer? Sure, they've been taught not to do that or this or what could happen, and then right. But it's the limbic system, right? Has nothing to do with executive functioning that says uniform, gun, run. Or even fight, but mostly run, right? And then what are the limbic systems of the police officers coded for? Does a black male running away sort of in their brain a little bit like a runaway slave? Out of control, a threat to their life and what? They have to, get control. Fast way to get control is with the gun. So I'm not saying either side right, wrong. It's not a moral judgment. It's more like the neurobiology. There is something happening that goes beyond cognition. And so then when we try to explain it, right, we really can't fathom what's actually going on because we're just thinking about it, right? And maybe not acknowledging the neurobiology of what's actually going on. Somebody had their hands, no? Maybe? Yeah, in the back.
What I was thinking when you were saying that from the policeman's perspective is the danger that it is to the social order that they're sworn to protect and uphold more than
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, the policeman is kind of there to separate the society from the more primitive aspects. And if somebody is disobeying the policeman, whether they're African American or not, the policeman may think that this person is a danger to what I'm sworn to protect. What I'm here for, they're a threat to the work I do with my job.
And they have to restore order.
Right. Even if it means taking a life to do that.
How do you know that person's challenging the system? You might be just walking down the street. I've been beaten by the police, and I was walking to a concert. So, I mean,
they make assumptions.
They make assumptions, and they assume that black men are criminals. Mm-hmm. And remember the thing about the police, they were founded by plantation owners, by the Barbados Code. This is not like black people and white people getting together and say, we're going to form a police department. These were founded by the plantation owners because they considered blacks their property, and blacks who escaped from slavery, the Underground Railroad, were considered mentally ill.
I saw another hand go up over here somewhere. Maybe not.
Well, I just wanted to say, what you just described as a cultural complex.
Say a little bit more, Stephanie.
Well, when someone gets activated, we have to see that as some form of complex, right? It takes over for an ego that's able to reflect and be centered and grounded. So what happens in those moments might be related to the personal unconscious, something that happened personally to someone as they were growing up, some type of impingement. But it could also have to do with cultural complex. When the African American man sees the uniform and the gun and he runs, he's not able to be in touch with his ego in those moments. He is overtaken by the complex that says he won't survive because historically, culturally, African American men were beaten, and he could be in danger, so he must run. So there is a way that what you're describing neurobiologically is also what we're talking about in terms of a conflict.
And many of you have seen some of the new research out there on some of the intergenerational aspects of trauma, so that if a grandparent has experienced something, you're more likely to have a phobic response, literally, to it. And so, I think it's very profound, and it really fits exactly with what we're talking around. And then the predominant culture may say, well, why it's irrational that the person ran from the police, like Anita was saying. In fact, perfect sense, and it may be in the genetic DNA, but literally they're talking about this change in genetic code and what that means.
Well, and this is really related to Jung's word association experiment, because that's how he developed the notion of the complex. When he would read out a word, and a person would have some kind of physiological response and not be able to respond to the word that was being read. But the other thing he noticed was that very often members of the whole family had the same response, even though they may not have experienced a particular trauma. So you're on something, especially mother daughters.
And I can't help but think of, for whatever reason, thinking about these aspects of the complex and how it's triggered in that way, but like the predator-prey relationship, and how they're running not only the cultural complex that's triggered, but the running away. And also, when we think about that relationship in animals and how the movement prompts the response as well, and how that might play into it too. It's just a thought, and I don't know how to make sense of it.
I think you're onto something. And I want to just have you look at this. And this was sort of a different kind of look at sort of the brain and the nervous system and whatever. But if you kind of look at this, how this is laid out, conscious, unconscious, and you notice where the metaphorical brain is that contains the information about archetypes, right? And the story. It's in the limbic system. It's not in the cortex, right? So it really doesn't contain executive functioning, right? And when the vulnerability or threat goes up, the conscious cortical structures go totally offline. And this is only what you're dealing with, the limbic and the reptilian, right? And so I was looking at that, and I know Stephanie's trying to help me learn this stuff.
No.
But I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. That makes so much sense.
Oh, that's it, exactly. It's wonderful.
Right. It's nonverbal. It's based on image, sensation. There are some base patterns. So that pattern of running away, needing control, all that sort of thing. Long-term memory, and if it's in the limbic system, it doesn't have date and time stamps. It's implicit memory. It's not explicit memory, this long-term memory. So is it ancestral memory, even, that's wired into our limbic system? I think so. And low involvement processing. It's not taking the long route to go up through our cortical structure. It's very much like activation, reaction, activation, reaction, activation, reaction. Right? And yes, I just thought this was an interesting, right? And then over here, the character archetype story, the carrying of the archetypal narrative.
Where is that from?
Oh, thank you for. Maybe you'll give me your card, and I can even. It's from one of my presentations, but for some reason I don't know where I got it from. But I'll try and find out because I'm curious myself. But I do it on. I use it in. I couldn't remember. I was trying to remember, and I just found it yesterday, where I had that slide, and because I was thinking about, wow, I think I remember that it actually contained in how archetypes are stored in the brain and in the nervous system, and I found it last night, and it's in my presentation on self-regulation, actually, right? And so I think about, all the times when we act. Now, Stephanie's been trying to tell me that fundamentally, there's a piece of this that doesn't change. And you said, right? I said, well, we can overcome this, right? We can transform it and overcome it. And you said,
it's always there.
It's always there, Stephanie.
It's the awareness.
Right. So I said, I have these 6 steps in terms of self-regulation. And I think they're primarily, like I said, I mostly do trainings for therapists. That I think it would apply to anyone. And I said, I think the police, like everybody, should get this information, these 6 steps. That first we have to kind of attune, right, to like our own activation. Just even notice that we're activated, right? And then we have to accept what's already here. That activation's already here. That narrative's already here. That history's already here. The traumatization's already here. We have to accept that that actually is already here. Right? Even when I don't want to think it's here, it's actually already here. And then regulate myself. I'll use myself. Regulate it like kind of bring it into consciousness, work with it or whatever, and reflect and evaluate. All right? And then in a mindful way, do something or intervene or whatever. But oftentimes, you know what I think happens? I think oftentimes we go from 1 to 5. We go to noticing, activation, and then acting. Right? And often the acting is not mindful. And then kind of integrating it into the consciousness. Right? And I told Stephanie this story, and then I'll end because the time I want people to be able to talk and bring things up if they want. About 7, 8 years ago, maybe, I was doing a presentation with Mary Jo at the Naomi Ruth Cone conference. It's a conference they have in the spring every year in Evanston, and it's named after a woman by her parents. They start this conference, and the parents, she committed suicide. She was a social worker who had major depression and eventually committed suicide. And her parents do this conference once a year. And Mary Jo and I were doing this presentation. Just so happens it's in the synagogue, and the basement, the air conditioning was out. And so it was kind of crowded. And I got up to talk, and everybody in the audience was sort of middle-aged and older and white. And they had this look of disapproval on their face. And I froze. I went into a freeze. I couldn't talk. I said, Mary Jo, you gotta talk. You gotta take off. She goes, huh? I said, I can't talk. You gotta get up. And I sat down. And she got up and she acted like, it was okay. Like nothing, she didn't even say anything. She just went on and she just did the presentation. And then this dissociated image came into my mind of when I was like about 7 years old. I was in New Orleans and I'd taken my little cousin Marie Chanel to get her allergy shots. And my grandmother had given us money, I was so proud, to stop on Canal Street, which is sort of like State Street in New Orleans. Canal Street to get a hot dog, French fries, and a Coca-Cola. So we came back from the doctor's. We were going to switch streetcars on Canal Street. And then I took her and we went into the store, and the name of the store is Maison Blanche. Anybody know what that means? Mm-hmm. White House, yes. And I went up and I said, well, I had 2 hot dogs, 2 French fries, and 2 Coca-Colas. And the woman looked at me and she goes, can't eat in here. You gotta go around the back to the annex. And so I was holding my little cousin's hand, because she's 3 years younger than me, and we turned around, and it was sort of like this walk of shame past all these white faces with this look of disapproval. And so when I was given the presentation, I reacted based on what had happened when I was 7 years old. I was in the same mind state, and I was just as ashamed, just as frozen, just as traumatized as I had been then. But now that I know it, right, it's in my consciousness, I can regulate it. I know you guys aren't those people in Maison Blanche, right? I know where it comes from. I know how to manage it. And so I guess the only thing I want to say is the more we can attune to our own shadow parts. I have anything about that? The more we're going to have access to our own wisdom, actually, I think. And that as much as we can acknowledge that we have them and bring them into consciousness. And I think this last part is the last quote is the one I really wrestle with in myself too, which is this: such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. And if he only learns to deal with his own shadow, then he has done something real for the world. And I wrestle with that because I don't want to believe that that's the truth. I want to believe that it's not in me, it's out there. But if it's out there and it's not in me, then I really can't change it. I don't have that control. The way I have power and the way I have control is once I bring it online and acknowledge that it's already there. So that's what I'm saying, and I don't know if you want to.
Let's stand up and. Now we'll just have a wrap up and answer any questions you might have and have a discussion. We didn't talk about microaggressions. Did you want to just say something about that?
Well, microaggression are aggressions that kind of fall under the radar. So I can give a couple of quick examples if that's okay.
Yeah.
So it's usually deeply embedded in our culture and in our vernacular. So I really had a lot of activation when my daughter was in high school around two things. The use of that's so ghetto. Because it was never about something that was good. All right? And I know there were ghettos in Poland, but when I hear ghetto, I'm not thinking of Krakow. I'm thinking of the South Side or the West Side or, Watts in Los Angeles. I'm thinking of black people. So that's so ghetto to me is a microaggression, a micro insult, or whatever against, poor black people. And the other one that really activated, and I really, wouldn't allow it in my house to use either one of them, that's so gay. I cannot tolerate that either because, again, it was not about something that was a compliment. And so those, and it was firmly embedded. I don't know if has anybody else heard people use, so firmly embedded, it's like, it's, and then it's just tried, brushed off or whatever as though it didn't mean anything, but it means something. And if you live in a ghetto or if you're gay, it means a lot, when people say things like, so those are examples of insults, microaggressions in the terms of insults. But it's microaggressions. It can be insults or things that actually the person's does not necessarily have a malevolent intent, but because it's so embedded in the culture or in the vernacular, it becomes sort of this automatic reference place or whatever. There are micro assaults, that they're not a threat to life and well-being, but they are assaults nonetheless.
Kind of like snarky.
Yeah. So is that okay? Yeah. Because we only have like 10 minutes.
Wanted to make sure we covered that.
Yeah.
So, questions?
What just came up for me about microaggressions in this context was about them as part. I wonder if part of the way to understand it is that they do represent a part of the cultural complex that's kind of surfacing in that moment. It's like, why is that? Why are you saying? What's the meaning of that's so ghetto or that's so gay? It's because it's carrying the load of, so it's like a symptom in a way of the broader cultural complex that's shared.
It's unconscious in us to say things that maybe for us we think is neutral, right?
But it has this meaning because it's carrying this thing that we all.
But it has enormous meaning if we think about what's happened historically and culturally in this country. So, very important.
I also just had to, I was so, there's something about the whole, various things that you've been sharing with us today that I feel like in the direction of this self-awareness that I do feel very affected. And one of the things when you brought up about plantations, about police, you were saying?
Police were found, plantation owners found that the police under the Barbados Code.
When? You're saying like in the
1700s, and the highest, the place where slavery was the highest was Newport, Rhode Island. That's where all the slaves came in Wall Street.
So part of what was evoked for me when you brought this up was this sort of painful integration of the reality that plantation owner culture is part of my cultural complex.
Yes.
And so part of what people are saying about seeing the Ku Klux Klan and being like, oh no, that's not me. Those are those Southern whatever, but it's like, oh no, that's my shared. That's part of them.
Well, right here in Chicago, and it was interesting to me that I found this really strong, there's a strong paternalistic attitude that I sensed here in Chicago. Coming from Texas, Austin, Texas originally, where everybody's, out there fighting their battles. But the Pullman train community was all about the plantation owner, really, controlling a whole community. They had to buy their food there. They had to pay him rent. This was their employer. They had to have housing with him. And basically he controlled their lives. So that, that was after plantation period, but it still gets enacted all of the time in different ways and different forms. And just to have the eyes to see some of these things is really, really crucial. And I think very often many of us are committing microaggressions all the time without recognizing them. Other questions, comments?
I'll throw this in. If people are interested in reading more about microaggressions, there's a wonderful book by Claudia Rankine, who is a poet. The book is called Citizen, and it's not actually verse poetry. They're sort of short blocks of text and images, and it's it's autobiographical, it's historical, and it's really wonderful.
Thank you.
Rankine, Rankine, Claudia Rankine.
Oh, is it E on the end?
It has an E on the end. Yeah.
I want to write that down.
Yeah, you'll love it. She's wonderful.
And the name of the book again?
Citizen.
One thing I wanted to bring up is that I know we've been talking about African American, but when you do research with some other immigrant groups or refugee groups like I've done with the Hmong people who have a little darker skin, especially they stay up about it, they get darker in the summer when they go out and work in the gardens. But a lot of times they wouldn't judge race in the same way we do. In fact, I was puzzled one time when I had a garden with them, and the Hmong people who didn't know me thought I must be Hmong because I was behaving like a Hmong person. So the skin isn't always the important, skin feature isn't always the important factor, but the context in which you're in and behaving. And because they've given me a Hmong name, I must be Hmong. I was eating their food. Well, who else would eat this kind of food but a Hmong person? But I'm not Hmong. And then they went on and, well, then you must be Chinese or you must be Korean. So they were very confused. Or your husband must be Hmong, because you'd have to cook this kind of food for him.
All right, is this the Hmong, like the...
It's not Hmong, but it's
Hmong? Okay.
The air out here.
Oh, okay, but it's spelled with an H, right? Because when I've taught the cultural complex before, I showed the film Gran Torino, which I thought was an excellent example of cultural complex, and the man having to confront that within himself.
Yeah. It's just that it was kind of confusing because I
It's very
thought, well, I'm clearly white, Right. I'm clearly not mom, but they were very confused because
That was very helpful. It's extremely complicated. Yeah.
Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I like to find literature to support some of the analytic ideas. And one thought I had was Chinua Achebe.
Yes.
Who?
Chinua Achebe. He's African, so the name is
okay.
hard for us. But he makes a point that around 1600, it was very convenient for Europe to have an oven. Just at the dawn of colonialism, that suddenly there was an economic incentive to put the other on the Africans, and they can emerge, the Caucasian can emerge proud and erect. And, isn't that not projecting the complex cultural complex? And we've all benefited.
Well, I mean, you could say manifest destiny is a cultural complex, right? Anything else? You all have been wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your patience.
This podcast is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Share it all you like as long as you maintain the attribution to the speaker, but please do not change it or sell it. If you like this episode, tell your friends about us or leave us a review on iTunes. For more information about classes, training programs, videos, audio, this podcast, or to find a Jungian analyst near you, visit our website, www.jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2019 supporter-level donors, Bill Alexi, Usha and Ashok Bedi, Circle Center Yoga, Arlo and Rena Compan, Eric Cooper and Judith Cooper, Lorna Crowell, D. Scott Dayton, George J. Didier, the Kull Family Foundation, Ramakrishnan and Full Bloom Lotus, Suzanne G. Rosenthal, Deborah Stutzman, Deborah Tobin, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, and Gerald Weiner. If you would like to support this podcast, just go to jungchicago.org/give.